Good evening. I'm coming up on my first anniversary of performing the analysis on the Pennsylvania wells. As you can see, I took a look here at 6 counties along the border of New York. If I'm going to look at the production of producing wells in PA as a basis for projecting into New York, I selected as many wells as I could that were relevant in those 6 counties. And you can see this is the area that gets all the hype here. I also took a look, someone said that there's a lot of high-producing wells in southwestern PA, so your model is not relevant. And so I took that on as a challenge, and so now I've added another whole series of wells in southwest PA as part of this presentation. I took a structured approach to this based on my experience. You need a good recipe if you're going to take on an effort like this. And I was fortunate enough to be pointed toward the PA DEP oil and gas reporting website, which has all the production data for all the wells in Pennsylvania. So I started out by downloading 35,000 records into a spreadsheet and said, what have I gotten myself into? But luckily, those 6 counties chopped it down to only 7,000. I went through and found all the producing horizontal wells. That's anything that has a volume reported over a time period. And that turned out to be 1,795. So I'm getting down to a manageable number. So I went through every single one of those wells and identified the first reported production period to define, so I could compare all the wells across comparably. That turned out to span 92 towns. So I was able to not only understand the international production of a well itself, but of a town and of a county. Because when I looked at all the numbers, 1,795, I didn't see any patterns, I didn't see any trends. So I knew I was going to have to aggregate up and look at a broader geographical comparisons to determine if there were any. Then once I've done that work, I can plot that numeric information on top of the maps that Brian just introduced you to. And I created a couple of my own creative graphs to get that message across. And I did find some unarguable patterns in that information that were sufficient, more than sufficient in my opinion, to project into New York. All of this data is publicly available. If anybody wants to do this again, have at it. Here's a decline curve that is part of a Chesapeake Energy presentation, and many of you have probably seen this. The initial production is up here at the top of this curve, and it drops off rapidly. So one of my first challenges was the well data comes in at anywhere from 10 days, because it just got brought online at the end of a 6-month reporting period, all the way up to a full reporting period. So what I did was I mathematically moved those up by month, and in many cases, if a well had been online for the entire 6 months, that value that's in their database actually got increased by about 35 to 40%, so that I could compare all the wells on an equal basis to do trending. So I have this big spreadsheet full of 1,795 numbers, and I got to figure out how to find a pattern. I spent 33 years doing this kind of work because I was a system architect. I had to build the blueprint for these large, complex systems. So I had to always abstract up out of the weeds because that's where all the engineers were working. And I said, well, I got to introduce some levels here. So I computed the median value across all those wells. It came out to be 4.2. So I set up 4 categories, 0 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 7, 7 to 31. And I gave them colors. And because we're operating in New York up here, I had to put a special black color in down here to cover wells that are less than 1 million cubic feet per day. So now I've got a color scheme. I went through the entire spreadsheet and color-coded every one based on this levels. Then I aggregated all those into another spreadsheet that was organized by town. So each column here, this is a sample of 4 towns out of the 92, And I picked these for a reason. You can notice that some of the towns, the performance level was pretty similar, and then in others, like Leroy, it ranged all the way from 0.4 million cubic feet per day up to 9 in the same town. So I computed the median IP at the town level, which is on this row right here, and color-coded that as well. And then I also added the thickness and depth parameters of that town, each town, so that I could plot these on the map. So now let's take a look. I also aggregated, now we're going to start at the county level and we're going to drill down. So at the county level, all the wells in those two counties came out to be basically above median, and that's in the thick shale between 250 and 325 feet. Then moving west into the shallower shale, we drop a couple points, a couple more points going into Tioga, PA, and then over there in Potter and McKean, we're down to low production across the entire town. So there's a clear pattern here from thick to thin. So now, Brian said he expected to drop, and guess what? In PA, it does, and it's dramatic. The wells over here, there's no orange, no red, and a couple of green. And other than that, it's pretty much black and blue. Now, my last presentation, I hadn't put in the second or the first half of 2013 because I didn't have time, but I did have time for this presentation, and this is what I found, which kind of collaborates what Chip was saying about the consolidation. 255 new wells came online. They're mostly drilling in the sweet spot area in Bradford and Susquehanna. They added wells in 11 new towns, but there's not a whole lot of change in the IP over there at the county level. Actually, interestingly, Susquehanna drilled 98 wells to actually drive their median IP down a half a point. So now let's take a look inside each of those counties. Each one of these dots is a town. And you can see these are the three higher performing counties. There were a total of 1,290 wells in these three counties. 63% of them are above the median value. And the scale over here goes from 0 to 12. So there were actually 3 towns that had all red wells in that sweet spot area. Pretty dramatic. So that's where you read all the press. Those are the wells that get hyped. And of course, they're all going to be like that in New York. Well, here's more of the reality for New York. This is the more relevant shale characteristics I'm going to show you in a minute. But that's a pretty big drop. You saw there was all this stuff up here on the previous chart. Well, the equation just flipped. It flipped from 63 above median wells percent to 76 below median wells. And you don't see any red towns on there, you only see one orange. That's not a good sign. So now I've got all the data that I need to start identifying the patterns and trends that I want to project into New York. So let's plot those towns, those dots, those colored dots on top of the 4 key parameters, shale parameters. This is total organic content. And each one of these wells, these are the 92 towns plotted over top of that. The higher level of TOC is, the red, yellow, and light green, and the lower TOC is the darker green colors. Now, one would have expected, if this was a valid indicator of the ultimate production of a well, that those guys would have been over here. But they're actually over in the poor shale. As an engineer, my conclusion on this chart is that there is no pattern and there is not much correlation there to be useful for any projections. However, When we get to the depth, this is the same map that Brian presented. Let's take a look at those same dots as they walk through the shale. In the really deep stuff, that's the sweet spot. As we move north and west, it just keeps dropping off. So, conclusion, as the shale gets shallower, the production drops off. Here's another way of looking at that same data. This is the percentage of each of those different levels in each of the thickest layers. So over here is the deepest shale, and you can see that 60% are high performers, but it drops off dramatically as you go into shallow shale. Whereas the poorer performers start increasing pretty steadily as you go down. And I just drew those lines out there to project what the production would be likely at some of the depths that don't exist in PA but exist in New York. So now let's take a look at thickness. Same deal. In the thick shale, we have the good performers. As the shale gets thinner, and over here in the 50 to 150 range, you don't see many even green dots. It's mostly blue and black. Interestingly, as was mentioned, Chesapeake is divested of their leases in northern Susquehanna, even though the sweet spot is just south of there. And here's the equivalent look at the thickness. It drops off dramatically as it gets shallower. And here, I didn't have to project anything. This is real hard data. There's 50 to 150 foot thick shale in PA, and you can see it drops off where 100% of the wells below 150 feet thick, or at least 98%, are below the median production levels. So I took a look on that challenge from someone unnamed out here in the west. What's going on out here? I took a look at almost, 1,000 wells, and this is that sweet spot down here. Now that sweet spot doesn't look anything like this sweet spot. That's 3.5. So that's kind of a Tioga County level production. They drilled a lot of wells, even though this is shallow shale, and they are getting some good performance wells. Something else must be going on here. But you notice as you come north into shallower shale up here, those drop off dramatically. And here's the depth view. And this kind of explains why they're actually getting some high-performing wells in that shallow shale, because it's between 7,000 and 8,000 feet deep. So you've got that pressure that Brian was talking about. Okay, now let's take a look at both of these parameters together, because if I want to project into New York, I need to project both on thickness and depth at the same time. So this is the depth from 3,000 down to 8,000, and here's the thickness from 50 to 300. So what would we expect over here in the thick, deep shale? So I added up all the wells within each one of these characteristic zones, and guess what? Really good stuff's over there. These are the median IPs for each of those zones, and the number of wells that contributed to it is in the upper corner. So a lot of wells, really high performing wells down here. But as we come into thinner, shallower shale, it drops off rapidly. And then it turns out it was really nice that I did that western stuff, because it filled in some of those missing holes that we don't have in the northern PA. And so I now have real hard data for most all of the projections into New York. So where does New York fit in this grid? Well, interestingly, 80% of that map that Brian showed you from the S-Guys fits into those 4 squares up there. That's 80%. The rest of the Marcellus is spread across these zones, but the predominant area is in these 4 cells right here. But just to be thorough and complete, I used the yellow box drop-offs in each of these columns to project the diamonds in the cells where they weren't represented by PA. So notice that below 150 feet thick and 4,000 feet deep, you're not even getting a half of a million cubic feet per day. So now I'm going to take the results of that matrix and I'm going to take the data within each of those thickness zones and I'm going to project into New York. So these towns have no relevance to New York projections because they're below or thicker than 300 feet. As we come into the next zone, it only affects these two little blips right here. And there's a cutoff line here at 5,000 feet. So I only use a handful of towns. I could only use a handful of towns to fit that cell from that layer. And I get green diamonds up in those little sections. If I continue that process up, I get pretty much below median level performance across that little region right there. Now what do you think is going to be the next color? Everything below 150 foot thick and 4,000 feet deep is a half a million cubic feet or less. So that's what I mean by 80% is not even close to productive. And so the values that are associated with those are range from 2.4 to 3.5. Well, we're not done. We got one more chart here, over mature. Notice this is over mature over here. I said that I think, based on this, notice here, this is the sweet spot, and right away it drops off to green and blue. So that line of death that Terry Oegeler proposed is real. It's happening in real data. And I believe it arcs up like this. And so I've got X's through these green diamonds. So all that's really left is this little area here. And so those teeny little TCF bars on Chip's chart, that's why. You take that area and you throw in the operating costs and the economics and the taxes, and there's not a lot left. So, in summary, I found consistent production pattern across all 2,818 wells, both in northern and south or western PA. The production decreases clearly as the shale gets based on thickness and depth. Production variables were not really tied to TOC that much. That wasn't a good indicator. And the production is dropping off rapidly as you approach those over mature areas. So the patterns can reliably be projected into New York. As far as New York goes, it would be limited production at the PA border and very low production elsewhere. So the price of gas would have to go awfully high. I've done some sensitivity on that. Even at $8 per MCF, it doesn't change that story above that 150-foot line much at all. So thin shale means you have insufficient gas reservoir, just not big enough. Shallow shale means you don't have enough pressure. That dropped off dramatically. You didn't see any blue transition there. It dropped off below 4,000 feet. It dropped off dramatically right to black. So that's the conclusion.